You know, I have a lot of friends in France and Italy and Israel, and they're all barrels. What's the difference between whiskey barrels versus wine barrels?
That's an excellent question. Generally speaking, whiskey barrels, particularly in the US, are charred on the inside. They're made of American white oak, and then that oak is charred. They apply fire, and it creates a dark charcoal level inside the barrel. This gives a whiskey its color, some flavors including the flavors of caramel, vanilla, things like that that are very characteristic to whiskey. Wine barrels typically are toasted. So the way they apply heat is much slower and lower, and instead of getting that really dark color, it's a lot more subtle and adds more toasty flavors to the wine.
That's so interesting. So as a whiskey distiller, I've tasted your whiskey, I love it, and we're doing a fun project together. Would you be able to make wine?
We could. We'd have to pull a different license.
Forget about it.
Yes.
As a whiskey distiller, understanding the detail of, is it the same like wine? Because somebody once told me that beer is like baking a cake. You miss a little bit, it's over, it's done. Wine is like cooking. There's something wrong, you can still blend it with something else. So what is whiskey?
Whiskey, I would say, is a little closer to baking. There is a blending component, and I'm a huge fan of using different barrels to create the flavors that you're really looking for through blending.
So you're a baker, but not a chef. You're a little bit of both?
Depends what you're making.
Dessert,
but
maybe?
I would say, generally speaking, it's not a forgiving process. You really need to be very specific about your processes and understand the science behind it. As much fun as it all is, it's very sensitive.
Clean.
All that, yeah.
So what is whiskey? Everything aged is whiskey? Or everything distilled is whiskey? When I go to Scotland, when I go to Ireland, what is whiskey?
Whiskey is a distilled spirit made from grain as the alcohol source that is then aged in wooden barrels.
Well, who came up with the term whiskey?
My understanding is it comes from a Gaelic word called whiskeyba, which really means water of life. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation.
No, but I think so.
Quite a bit.
As far as I remember, it's called water of life.
Exactly.
So what is the difference in single malts from Scotland versus whiskey bourbon from American whiskey?
There are a lot, in fact, probably an infinite varieties of whiskey. But a single malt whiskey, which is our main specialty, is made entirely from malted barley. And we use a variety of new as well as used barrels. The nice thing about being a distillery is I have access to bourbon barrels, rum barrels, rye barrels that I'm able to dump that product, make a rye product or rum product, and then immediately fill that with new make single malt to become a whiskey and also take on the flavors of what the barrel held before. We also do use new barrels. I work with a cooperage in Missouri to get us barrels at...
Newer barrels are like babies? They're more like...
Well, I think of them as my babies.
Yeah?
I definitely,
Okay.
I think of them as my babies and try to care for them, over the course of years and try to get them to mature, as it were.
Why single malts, 10 years old, 15-year-old, it gets better, but American whiskeys, 4 years old, is as great as 6 years old, or isn't? What happens to, what's the difference?
Generally speaking,
because I've seen, like when I taste bourbon or American style whiskey,
yes,
it's a little rougher. It's like our pickup trucks.
It is.
It's not like the smooth Audis. But when you go to Scotland, you get a little softer touch.
It is, and there's two components of that. One is that American whiskeys are typically aged in brand new barrels. So if you think about a barrel as sort of like a tea bag, you're making a pot of tea. The first time you use it, that cup is going to be really strong. The second time, not as much. And the third time, even less so. So you're constantly extracting, and there's like sort of a diminishing return. Scotch whiskey typically uses refill barrels, ones that are already used, so they're not as aggressive. You would use that for cost and also recycling. So American bourbon makers are only able to use barrels once, but there's still a use for those barrels. And Scotch whiskey makers and other whiskey makers are very keen on taking those barrels and using them to make they're sort of pretty delicate products. The other component that would make aging work better for a long term in Scotland is the climate. It is generally speaking cooler and more damp than more humid than in the US. And one thing that's interesting about us is we are, we're here in the Chicago area. It's kind of cold, and most of this area is actually below grade, meaning that it is a little more damp and it has a more stable temperature throughout the year. So rather, I would say that our maturing conditions are actually closer to what you would find in Scotland than what you would find in, say, Kentucky with bourbon whiskey.